Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well. Today we are going to be looking at the history of agriculture, or to be more accurate, the history of human agriculture. Remember that first lesson we saw those other examples of animal agriculture. But before we start, we're going to review. Okay, so in our last lecture we looked at science and skepticism. And if you remember, when we talked about science, we said that science is both a body of knowledge and, importantly, it's a method. It's a method of learning about the natural world. It's based on empiricism, which is this idea that we get info about the world from our senses. And importantly, empiricism uses observation and experimentation. So the scientific method has a number of steps. You'll see some variation sometimes. But essentially, what it involves is you first ask a question. This may be something that you're just interested in about the natural world. From that question, you may do a little research and you're going to form a hypothesis that explains something. You'll then experiment, do an experiment, and then analyze your results. Now, there's a couple important things to remember about science. One is that what we're doing is falsifying hypotheses or rejecting hypotheses. It gets a little weird, but essentially we are, instead of when we do an experiment proving that this is what happened, we are proving that there is some sort of difference. Now, it may seem not like a big deal or that it's some weird kind of linguistic trick that we're doing here, but it's really important because science doesn't necessarily explain 100% prove things 100%, but it's this collective body of evidence that you gather that tends to show that something is true. So because of that, we often replicate studies, and we're going to do multiple studies on a topic or in a field. And as we do more and more studies, we gain more and more information, and we learn more and more about some aspect of the world. We also use replication within our study, right? There is variation that can occur. Often when we're doing studies, if we're doing a simple study or even more complex ones, we may be interested in one variable, maybe the effect of temperature or the effect of light or water on the growth of plants. And we just want to investigate that one thing. Well, there's a whole host of other variables that could play a role, such as soil quality or the position of where your plants are in your experimental tent, the actual plants themselves, and how the seeds are. So, because of that, to try and deal with those potential effects of those different variables, we use replication within our study. So, we don't just, if we're comparing the effects of temperature, say, we won't just have one plant growing in one temperature and one plant growing in another. We'll have multiple plants growing in each type of treatment. And then lastly, science takes time. Like I said, this is a body of knowledge that we continually add to through more and more experiments. And as we do more and more experiments, we get more and more accurate as to what is actually causing what we're interested in or affecting the world in that way. So that was science. Then we talked a little bit about skepticism. And when I say skepticism, all I mean is just a questioning attitude. And really, I talked about skepticism in regards to evaluating news or information or articles that you may read. Because, like I said, you live in a time where you have access to this whole host of information, this wealth of information, but not all of the information is equal. So it's up to you now to evaluate that news article or that whatever you're reading or seeing to see, is it actually true? Does it make sense? So there's a number of tips. You want to evaluate the quality of your source. Where's this, if we're just talking about a news article, where's this article coming from? Kind of some things to look for if you're looking at a website. Is it a crappy website? Is it a nice website? It's not always the case, but generally, if you have a nice website, it means that the organization that's producing this article might be a little more reputable than just some than a different organization. Same with how long has the organization been around. If it's relatively new, that might be a red flag as opposed to an older organization. Again, not always the case, but something to look for. How does the article make you feel, right? If it's trying to play on your emotions, there's a chance that you want to be a little leery about the information, right? It plays on your emotions because they want you to click on it and read it. Other things, other big tips: investigate bias in your news sources. There is a level of bias in pretty much every source that you see, but there are degrees of it, right? There are some organizations, some news sources that are way more biased than the other ones, and they go on both sides of the political spectrum. So investigate your bias. There are resources to do it. There are also, if you are not looking at a resource, if you tend to be frequenting a news source and they are either always praising or always criticizing one political party or one political figure, you should be a little wary that that source is pretty biased. Importantly, you want to look for data, right? We just said that science is based on data. It's based on observation and experimentation, and science is a really great way for learning about the natural world. So you want to look for data in your news articles. They should include at least links to primary sources, and those would be journal articles or sometimes interviews, anything. You want to look for the data. If you're reading an article, if it's making a claim, it should have a link to support that claim. There are also other resources that you can look at to find primary sources. Another kind of common thing that you want to be aware of is that correlation is not always causation, right? Just because two things are correlated together doesn't mean one causes the other. I gave the example that if you're looking at ice cream sales and number of people sunburn, they are correlated. So as the number of ice cream sales increases, the number of people that are sunburned increases. Doesn't mean that ice cream is causing sunburn. It just means that the sun is causing both, right? So the hotter it gets, the more people that are buying ice cream. The hotter it gets, the more people are getting sunburned. So that's an important thing to look out for. If there is someone that is claiming they're an expert, check their credentials, right? A lot of times people will throw out fancy terms or fancy titles such as doctor, but really see what are they a doctor of, right? If they're talking about, I gave the example of evolution. If they're talking about evolution and they say, I'm Dr. So-and-so, see what their education is. A lot of times it's not, if it's definitely talking against evolution, a lot of times they are not doctors in that field. And then know yourself. So again, just like our news sources, we all have personal biases that we carry along with us. We have different ways that we view the world. It's important to understand that, try and expand your worldview, look at opposing viewpoints. It may be hard. It's easy to just fall in line with stuff that you believe in, but really try and work and look at and listen to, read about opposing viewpoints, and work at not being so married to an idea. Keep an open mind to maybe changing your mind about things. All right, that is that. Okay, so like I said, we're looking at human agriculture today. So let's start by looking at the origin of humans. Right, so the earliest homininians evolved around 4 million years ago. So homininians are essentially just the ancestors of humans. They are the line that starts when our ancestors broke off from the last common ancestor of chimps. So that earliest homininian evolved around 400 million years ago. Around 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens first evolved. So Homo sapiens are humans. And then around 100,000 years later, so 100,000 years ago, humans started migrating out of Africa, where they first evolved. And they spread eventually throughout the entire globe. Now, for the majority of our history, and when I say our, I mean the human race, we lived as hunter-gatherers. So we would hunt game, and we would supplement that hunting with foraging wild edibles, or maybe vice versa. We would forage wild edibles and supplement with hunting. Regardless, we were doing those two things, and that's how we existed for almost 100,000 years. But around 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, something happened. And that is, we switched from this hunter-gatherer lifestyle to an agrarian lifestyle. We became farmers. Now, this brings up the question of why. Why did we switch from this lifestyle that we had been doing for thousands and thousands of years to a completely new way of living? What were some of the environmental and social circumstances that led to the development of agriculture? So, if we want to answer this question, we can go about it and we can look at a number of different things. So, maybe the first thing that we'd like to look at is, where did agriculture develop in the world? So, again, this is starting around 12,000 years ago, and we see that agriculture developed really globally, right? It wasn't just one center of development and then it spread from there, but rather there are all these distinct regions across the earth where people began cultivating plants. So in the Middle East, we had various peoples growing wheat and barley, peas, and figs. In East Asia, we had the development of rice, millet, and soybeans. Over in Mesoamerica, we had the cultivation now of corn, squash, beans, and chili peppers. And this is some of the earliest examples. So this would be around that 12,000 years ago. A little bit later, we had the development of potatoes in the Andes. We had the development of cassava or yucca and squash in the Amazon basin. That's actually an article that I'm going to have you guys read for this week. It talks about that. And then we had bananas over in New Guinea. We had the development of sunflowers and squash in North America a little bit later now. And the cultivation and farming of date and oil palms and sorghum in Africa. So what's interesting is that, as I said in the beginning, that agriculture didn't just develop in one region and then spread, but it actually developed in all these separate regions throughout the world. And in a relatively short time period, right? This development is occurring simultaneously from a geological standpoint, right? So maybe there's a couple thousand years here or there, but talking about the history of the human race, when we've been around for 200,000 years, this stuff is occurring relatively rapidly and relatively close together. And even within regions, it's occurring in separate areas. So if we look at the Middle East there, it's not like one tribe or one civilization started cultivating wheat and barley, peas, and figs. But it was occurring separately a number of different tribes were independently started cultivating these different products within that region. So what this kind of suggests is that if agriculture is developing worldwide right around this time, that there is likely, or there may be, some global factors that are essentially priming the world or priming humans to start developing agriculture, right? Because it's not just it's occurring in one area, it's occurring globally all around the same time. So what are the conditions at that time that may have led to agriculture? So let's take a look at the environment, right? So agriculture is going to develop everywhere. What's the environment like around this time period? Well, 12,000 years ago marks the end of the Pleistocene. And the Pleistocene is essentially Ice Age, or we had a period of ice ages, right? It lasted from 2.6 million years ago to 12,000 years ago. And during this time period, our climate is cyclical. So we have a period of warming, and then we have an ice age, and our temperature drops. And glaciers move in and becomes very, very cold, and then we have another period of warming or an interglacial period, and then we have another ice age. And it goes like that throughout the Pleistocene. However, around 12,000 years ago, this period ends. And we start with a warming trend that continues to this day. Although now we've affected that warming to increase it even more. But 12,000 years ago, we have a period of warming so the Earth begins to warm. And as it warms, we have an increase in plant productivity, right? So our wild plants become more productive due to this warming. And this increased productivity of wild ancestors, we could have seen an increased productivity of wild ancestors of domestic crops that makes it an easier shift to start cultivating them. Right? This warming climate is also more suitable to plant propagation, to actually farming or cultivating more plants. Around this time, we also have a loss of Pleistocene megafauna. So megafauna are just big animals, right? And Pleistocene is that time period. So we had a number of large animals during this time period that we hunted. And they included mammoths and mastodons, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer. So around this time, where we're seeing this warming trend, more productivity in plants, we also see a loss of these large animal species that we were hunting for food. And they likely died off. Probably, most likely, the theory is that we overhunted them, and then this changing climate had effects on them as well, and due to both of those things, they died off. So we have a changing climate, and excuse me. How did this changing climate affect humans at the time? Right? So agriculture, we know around 12,000 years ago, develops everywhere. Around this time, we have this changing climate. It's getting warmer. How is this changing climate going to affect humans? Well, in 2005, Kavanaugh and others, if you guys see that ETAL, that just means as others, and others. So Kavanaugh and others in 2005, they created a computer model to assess how human demographics would have changed in response to this changing environment at the end of the Pleistocene. So what they did is they collected information on 220 recent forager societies. And then they examined the environmental and cultural factors that changed the population density and population sizes in these societies. Right? And they found that of all these factors, environmental productivity had the greatest effect. And then what they did is they compared this information that they collected to the information that we had on the environment and cultural conditions from 20,000 years ago to 4,000 years ago, right? So during this time period where agriculture is going to start to develop, they looked at what are the environmental and cultural conditions that exist at this time period, and how do they relate to what we've seen with changes in forager societies in present day. What they found is that in almost all of the cases where agriculture developed, an increase in plant productivity would have led to increased population densities in these societies. Right? And that's really important. So, as we put it all together, what does this all mean? So, around 12,000 years ago, we have a changing environment. It's starting to get warmer. We're seeing, because of that, we have increased productivity in our wild plants. And now we have conditions that are more suitable for the cultivation of these wild plants. Because of this increased productivity, we are seeing an increase in human population size at the time. Right? So our human population size is getting larger. And at the same time, we have a loss of megafauna, which was another food source that could have fed the human population. So if we put all these together, we start to see that these are the conditions that are now going to lead to the development of agriculture. And it's really this increasing human population size that's so important. Because when we look at the effects of agriculture on human society, one of the biggest effects that agriculture has is that it is more productive, and hence it allows for more people to live in an area. All right? Agriculture, as compared to hunting and gathering, is way more productive. It produces a surplus of food. As an example, they estimate that if we just had stayed as hunter-gatherers, the carrying capacity, so the maximum amount of people that could have existed on Earth, would have been 10 million people. And they think around that time, when agriculture starts developing, that was the population size of the Earth, around 10 million. And that is the max that the Earth can hold based on that way of living. However, with agriculture, as we see right now, we have a current population of 7.6 billion. So way more people can exist on the Earth through agriculture because it's so much more productive. So, and that is what we've seen, right? With agriculture, we saw this great increase in population. Now, what other effects did agriculture have? If we go back to right when it's starting to develop, well, all of a sudden we're going to see a change in the way of living in these different populations, human populations. So instead of being more mobile, our populations become stationary, right? We are staying in one area and we are growing our crops. And as a result, we see the rise of cities. And with that, we start to see this division of labor. So beforehand, everyone is out collecting food or hunting the entire time. Because farming is more productive, not everybody needs to be engaged in that activity. So you start to see this specialization or this division of labor. So you have your farmers who are just growing the food. And then you have other people who can take on other tasks within the city. And we start to see a specialization of crafts. So now you start to get your artisans and your masons and your blacksmiths. And they are all now taking on different tasks within a society instead of everyone just hunting and gathering. We see an increase in material technology, again, as a result of this. And we also start to see changing social dynamics, right? So no longer, if you get into conflict with another tribe, say, you can't really just move away anymore. It's not where you get into a little conflict with this tribe, all right, we're just going to go over here and we'll do our hunting and gathering here. Now, you're sedentary, so you have these areas that you need to start defending. You'll have variation in the quality of your land that is suited for growing crops or for where a city could be located. And this is going to start to lead to some more inequality in social groups, right? So now we have your farmers who have the best land, and maybe they're going to be more productive, they're going to make more money. Or now, because you have your farmers, you have people who can specialize in these other crafts, and now that becomes specialized, and they can produce these things, and they can make more money, and all of a sudden you start to see this inequality among social groups. So, another effect of agriculture. Continuing on, we can see that some of these effects aren't how we would qualify them, aren't necessarily good. Right? So agriculture, obviously, from an evolutionary standpoint, it is obviously beneficial. It's how, essentially, we all exist through agriculture. All of our societies are based. That's how we get our food. We don't really have hunter-gatherer societies anymore, except for, small isolated tribes. So there's a great benefit from an evolutionary standpoint, right? The societies that adopted agriculture outcompeted the societies that didn't. But if we think about it from a value standpoint of kind of how we apply values now, or ethical or moral values, or we may not see that the adoption of agriculture was great in all respects, right? It made us outcompete other societies, but there were some detrimental effects to it as well, right? One of which is, I kind of hinted at it with that social inequality that we saw before, but we also see that in agrarian society, for those practicing agriculture, they had more work and they had less free time. And this is definitely initially, right? So when they switched over, cultivation was a lot harder than hunting and gathering. And you had to devote more time to being a farmer. And because of that, you had less free time. And we see that in history with a decrease in art and storytelling when societies went from hunting and gathering to farming. Right? There's not a lot of art initially, there's not a lot of storytelling because no one's got any free time. They're out in the fields all day farming to grow food. Additionally, when they first switched over from hunting and gathering to farming, it was less healthy. Right? They began specializing growing certain crops, and that led to a less diverse diet. As a result, we see right when that switch occurs that people became shorter and they had less bone density, and these are signals of a worse diet. We also see a rise of infectious diseases. Right? People are now living in cities, they're living in close proximity to each other. These cities often had, especially early on, poor sanitation. And we now see a closer relationship with humans and domesticated animals that's going to allow diseases to jump over from those animals and begin infecting humans. So we have a lot of these negative aspects of agriculture that went on, especially initially. Now, later on, things reversed. We're lucky in the time that we live now that this isn't so anymore. But initially, there was a heavy biological toll to get to the place where we are now, where we have more free time, and we'd like to think we are healthy. It's probably up for debate. So again, these are some more impacts of that agriculture had on human society. How else did agriculture affect human society? Well, it has shaped our evolution. A really good example is lactase persistence. If you are of Western European heritage, you can most likely drink milk, eat dairy, and be relatively fine, have no gastrointestinal problems. That is because you come from ancestors that domesticated cattle. And all humans, when they are first born, they have lactase, which is an enzyme that lets them break down lactose, which is the sugar in milk. All right, so when you're a baby, you are producing lactase, and that lets you break down sugar that you're getting from your mother's milk. But historically, at a certain point, when you reach a certain age, after you're done weaning, you stop producing lactase. Well, because humans in these societies domesticated cattle and they were drinking cow's milk, they evolved to continue to produce this lactase throughout their lifetime. That is called lactase persistence. And that is why we can now drink, if we are of Western European heritage, we can now drink milk and have dairy with no issues. So, one way in which agriculture shaped our humans. Agriculture also had a number of effects on the environment. A lot of them not so great. Right? We had more land now needed to be devoted to agriculture and cities. As a result, we had a loss of wild habitat and wild species. We're in the process of what people refer to as the Anthropocene. So it's the era of the world in which humans have affected it so much. And we're also in a sixth mass extinction, a lot of scientists suggest. And that is, throughout history, there have been a series of mass extinction events. The most well-known one is that occurred around 65 million years ago when an asteroid came and wiped out most of the dinosaurs. But before that, there were a series of other extinction events that wiped out a majority of life on Earth. And many scientists think that we're in the process of one now. And this one is actually being caused by humans. That the effects that we've had on the environment are so great that we are just wiping out species one after another. And some of that effects is due to agriculture. As part of agriculture, at least historically, we have a lot of excess nutrients and animal waste products that can pollute water bodies. It takes water consumption to grow our crops. A big issue is topsoil depletion. We'll talk a little bit about a little bit later. It takes energy use, and now we have the burning of fossil fuels causing climate change, all related to some aspect of agriculture that is having an effect on the environment. So if you look at these number of things, you can see that, yes, agriculture has had a great benefit, but it's also had a great cost. And it's something that I want you guys to think about. And in your assignment for this week, what you're going to be doing is thinking about what life would look like now if agriculture never developed. So that's what I want you to think about. And some of this should help you in answering that question. Okay, so we kind of got the origins of agriculture, right? 12,000 years ago, the climate is changing, it's getting warmer. That means wild plants are more productive. The plants that are going to be the ancestors of our modern crops are more productive. The climate is now more suitable for these crops, for us to begin cultivating these crops. We have a die-off of big animals that we were hunting, and we got more people that we need to feed, and that sets us up to have the development of agriculture. And then agriculture changes society and shapes our evolution, as we looked at. Now we are going to jump all the way to post-World War II. So there's a lot of things that happen in between there, but I want to go to this point right here because post-World War II, we kind of see a big change in how we farm that has really led up until recent times and has shaped agriculture up until relatively recently. So, post-World War II, we have this shift in the U.S. towards more industrialized agriculture. And this means big farms growing one crop or a few crops at a time, right? And this shift is made possible by a number of things. We have new technologies and chemical use that was developed in the war or gets changed around to be, which was originally used for some sort of military purpose and then gets shifted around that we can now use for agriculture. All right, so we have these new technologies, new mechanization. We have the development of synthetic fertilizers, which is huge. And now we have government policies that occur around this time that are going to favor maximizing production. So we have, like I said, all these mechanizations that's going to help us essentially be more productive. We have synthetic fertilizers that we can now apply to our fields to increase yields. And we have the government pushing policies that for farms to get bigger and produce more and more crops that we can sell overseas. Now, because of these things, our food and our fiber productivity soared, right? We saw great increases in productivity. But this had a number of negative impacts as well, right? So we're pushing for these big farms, and it's these big farms that are only going to persist. So we see a loss of small farms, right? There's now a number of very, very big farms, a fewer number of farms, and they consist of very, very big farms. And your small, medium-sized farms are starting to go under. And this is going to change the communities in which these farms existed. And then this type of agriculture also had a number of environmental effects, some of which I talked about in that previous slide, right? Big one is the loss of topsoil. This type of industrialized agriculture depended on the application of synthetic fertilizer. Not a lot was given to the soil in which these crops, not a lot of thought was given to the soil in which these crops was grown. And as a result of this plowing and fertilizer application, we start to see a loss of topsoil in these areas. And it's the topsoil that's really important because it contains carbon and all these other nutrients that are important for plant growth. This is a big issue, and it's an issue that exists today. And then we also saw, on top of just the topsoil loss, we see environmental degradation. So just the loss of area, the runoff of all the excess nutrients that are polluting rivers and water bodies, and just the destruction of wild habitat. So bad aspects of this shift. And what this leads into, and what we're going to talk about really in the next lecture, is where we're moving on from then. So there was this shift post World War II to this more industrialized agriculture, and now we're starting to see a shift to what I'm going to refer to as sustainable agriculture, or more sustainable practices that take into account the effects that agriculture can have on the environment and change things around to help protect the soil and these environmental resources. They also utilize ecosystem services, which I'm going to talk about in the next lecture. And there are a number of examples of different types of sustainable agriculture, from polyculture to no-till to permaculture and things. And that's all going to be on your next lecture. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. You got a little history lesson on agriculture. It's a short little history lesson, but I thought it's pretty neat. It kind of sets us up now to where we are now and what the future of agriculture is going to be. All right, that is it. Have a good week. Do all your assignments, and I will talk to you guys later.